All right, let's move along. The reason I'm keeping you here on Halloween and all this is that we do want to move along, and we are, you say, well, you haven't wasted a lot of time in discussion. It's true, but I just have to keep going to get through this material, and I think it's worth reading it together because if you read it alone, it's different than to read it together to get the juice out of it. Look at this Protocol for the Elders of Zion. It's famous work. It's on page 85 here. It's still being published all over the Middle East. There's even copies of it being brought out in Japan. People actually believe this is a serious historical work. It was proved in the 1920s or 30s to be a rewrite of an and you won't understand this probably most of you, Napoleon III text that was written in France. It had nothing to do with Jews at all. It was an attack on Napoleon III, who was the emperor of France for a while in the 1850s or 60s. Then the Tsar's secret police got a hold of it and transformed it into this. We have a few excerpts here, but the way they talk about, other people is just horrendous. What I'm about to set forth, page 85, is our system from the 2 points of view, that of ourselves and that of the goyim. And I don't like when Jews do sometimes use that language of the goyim, which is a Hebrew term for the nations, but it sounds awful in English conversation. And therefore the best results in governing them are attained by violence and terrorization, not by academic discussions. This was actually probably an anti-socialist text too. Terrorist text when Jews were considered in the front line of socialist organizations. While you were outside, this young lady was asking me, how come if Jews disagree with each other so much do you have this system in Israel that is so centralized and so on? I said it's in structures of countries don't really change so easily. Environments have to be upgraded through amendments, etc. It's just like we don't even change our own constitution very easily. So even in a place like Israel, it takes time to upgrade things, and there are political forces that are entrenched. In this case, the two rabbinutes, the governing rabbi boards of Ashkenazi and Sephardi, that's still separate, just like in Ottoman times. Are totally against losing their power, so they don't want other rabbinic groups coming in. And so she then asked me, well, how come conservative Jews and Reform Jews support Israel? And I said, well, they don't all. They never did. There were a lot of anti-Zionist people back in the 20s and 30s when Israel was trying to come into formation. And particularly in England, we'll talk about the Balfour Declaration. It was the Jewish entrenched forces in England that objected to the Balfour Declaration because they thought that would mean British Jews should go to Palestine, and they didn't want to. So they didn't like the language of the Balfour Declaration, and they made Lord Balfour change certain things. I'll talk about that when the time comes. But I brought about the interesting example while you guys were out of there are still anti-Zionist Jews who are very in the public domain, in the public eye. Noam Chomsky's a perfect example. I mean, he's the sort of darling of the old and new left intelligentsia, and there couldn't be anyone more anti-Zionist than him. And so it isn't as if there aren't a lot of Jewish people who object to Israel, the structure of Israel. I think it undermines their position in the diaspora, as it is called.
I think the majority is pro-Israel.
Yes, and I was going to get to that point. That, however, and that was the next point, was that, still the majority of Jews feel that Israel is on the ledger of things more a plus than a minus. And therefore the majority are obviously going to support it as far as they can to some extent. And that doesn't mean all of them do. I mean, the Jews, for instance, they're trying to have a gay rights parade in Jerusalem, which is causing a lot of controversy. And this week I read that the Israel links on you a few of those if you want. If you want a right-wing security link run by Russian immigrants, debka.com is really, it's very interesting because they got a lot of Russian security links that they get information. Sometimes it's exaggerated, sometimes it isn't. Then there's Haaretz, which is a left-wing newspaper. I think it's haaretzdaily.com. And you can Google it up. Then there's the Jerusalem Post, that's jpost.com, which is the middle of the road. And then there's another one, it's called, what's it called? I think it's called inet.com, which is another newspaper, a Hebrew newspaper that has an English version. But those four, I mean, I look at those sites every single day just to follow what's going on in that country. Not that but wide, I'll tell you, there's a huge divergence of opinion on every column that exists in those papers. Huge divergence of, yes, this is Yediot HaAchronot, which is the newspaper. Yediot means, Achronot means final, Yediot means news. So final news, so they call it, I think they call it iNet or Ynet. I'm not sure if it's iNet or Ynet, maybe Ynet. I think it's probably Ynet.com. I've got it zeroed in among my favorites, so I don't really have to, look at what's being put up there. But if you pick up any of those 3 or 4, you'll find a huge cross-section of opinion in the talkback from Jews all over the world and non-Jews all over the world, evangelicals, even Arabs. There's Muslims from Palestine who are always cursing everything in the paper. I mean, and they print it all. And the talkback is really, really interesting on some of the, I mean, I just laugh my head off at some of the talkback. It's so weird. I mean, I don't know how much talkback you get in the American papers when you Google them up, but the talkback in the Israeli papers from all over the world, from Australia, from Holland, from Scandinavia, from England, from the US, from South America, from Lebanon, Palestine, Gaza Strip. And, whenever anything bad happens in the Gaza Strip, there's someone writes in, yeah, you Jews got it again, ha ha ha, or something like that, It's really colorful. That's all I can say. It's good for entertainment. It's good for a laugh. We'll take it so seriously. So, that's an answer to, just to make what she was asking more general here. There are a lot of and there was actually a movement in the early part of the last century called anti-Zionism. But as I said, on the whole, Jews are lukewarm. They don't think about it every day, but on the whole, they feel it's better to have Israel there than not, because at least they feel a certain amount of security after what they've seen happen in the last century or two. And, it's a shame that this nuclear thing has come into the equation, because that really does undermine the whole sense of security. And that's why I think that sooner or later something horrific is going to happen in the Iranian situation. The Israelis say that they're not going to let the Iranians get a nuclear weapon. The Russians are pushing as hard as they can to let the Iranians get a nuclear weapon. This is not a game that's being played. There's really serious stuff at stake, and something is going to pop. I don't know what. I don't know if the Israelis even feel capable of taking that out like they did the Iraq reactor, but everyone thinks that taking out the Iraq reactor in retrospect was, even though the French built it, and why the French were building it for them, nobody knows, except that they're so greedy for cash payments, the same as the Russians are now. Everyone thought that, in retrospect, was a good thing. I don't know what was going to happen with the Iranian thing, but I assume something is going to happen. And we'll see what does.
Did you see the thing, or did you hear about the thing on NPR today, where they were contrasting a bill that just got passed last month about Iran to a bill that got passed in like '98 about Iraq? And it's like this very seemingly innocuous bill, the "Why We Love Iraq" bill, right? Or something along those lines, right? And it gets passed, and it basically lays the groundwork for our response to certain events that if they were to conceivably unfold in the future, how we would respond.
Well, I wasn't speaking about the U.S. government in this particular instance, thank God, so I don't have to answer your question. I was speaking about the Israeli response to it. I wasn't speaking about what the U.S. is doing, because I have no idea. I don't even think the U.S. knows what it's doing.
No, the point was that they had this bill that was seemingly innocuous, but it was basically laying the groundwork for the war. And
well, that's a real shame, isn't it? That's a real shame. I really feel sorry for the Iranians. Same as I feel sorry for the Iraqis. I'm very sorry about that. We should let lunatics run the universe, I think. So if someone's laying some groundwork, maybe they're showing some foresight for the change. In any case, I have no idea what the bill is intended. I don't know the bill. And I'm not speaking about America at this point. I'm speaking about what the Israelis are going to do. And
so we're not like that with them then?
I don't think so. Not if you're going to read James Baker's coming report. He would like Israel to disappear from the face of the earth. The Bush administration? No, of course not. We're reading too much Noam Chomsky. That's a real problem. Not you reading him, but that's their line. No, I don't think that the U.S. government has ever been like that with the Israeli government. Certainly weren't that way in the first Gulf War. They wouldn't let the Israelis do anything to defend themselves, and they had to take missile strikes and depend on an American umbrella. It was humiliating for the Israelis and caused all the horrible things that occurred afterwards. It was a horrendous situation that caused several decades of demoralization in the country. So no, I don't think the Americans and the Israelis have ever been on the same track, except when it was useful, perhaps. And I don't think that what the Americans are going to do in Iran has anything to do with the Israelis. Maybe if the Americans feel threatened, they're more capable of doing what has to be done, perhaps there, if it has to be done. But I assure you, if the Americans don't do something and the Israelis feel that something should be done, it will be done. It's going to be done.
Yeah, that was actually the point I was trying to make. I think you've got me in your head as a peacenik, which I guess
no,
I am.
No, I'm a peacenik. I'm not talking. I think this idea of American-Israeli collusion is an imaginary, is more of the left-wing anti-Semitic assault that is going on all over the world at the moment, and it's just pure nonsense.
Yeah, probably. I mean, I turned my back on politics many years ago. So
if there had been an American-Israeli collusion, the Israelis wouldn't have botched the Lebanon campaign to the extent that they did. That's all I can tell you. I mean, that was pathetic. So I can't imagine there's realism. Because if there were Israeli-American collusion, they'd have wiped out Hezbollah and taken out the Syrian regime as well, so the Americans had a freer hand in Iraq, and instead they just fumbled everything. So I don't think there's any collusion at all on certain things, but to some extent maybe. Anyway, talking about the Israelis and their survival as a nation, and the Jewish people with regard to that. So it's tough to talk to someone behind my back here, but this is how you prefer it because you're an individualist. But
I was happy to move earlier. You told me not to bother. Do you want me to move?
No, I don't want you to do anything. I don't want you. You're a free spirit, you know. But it's hard to discuss with someone who's sitting behind me. That's all. But if you want to discuss behind me, that's fair enough. In any event, the Israelis, the situation of the Israelis, what I was bemoaning, if you like, was the fact that Israel, the support from American and other Jews towards Israel was they saw Israel as a thing of security vis-a-vis their situation in the world. And with the nuclear threat, it doesn't look like that anymore to them. And so this is quite likely going to change their attitude towards Israel quite a bit. And Israel looks more endangered than American Jewry, in fact. So, you know, what was the support based on? The sense that Israel, why was there greater support than that? Because Israel looked like, in the last analysis, there was a secure place that one could retreat or be saved by if it came to that. And now it doesn't look like that. Anyway. that's why I say to what you're saying, forget the American government, I'm talking about the American government. The Israelis will do something in the final analysis if no one else does. They will do something, and it will not be pretty. It will be really nasty. You know, this guy can talk as much as he wants in Iran, the way he's talking and so on, and work up the crowds across the whole Islamic world. But something horrendous is growing unless the international community puts a lid on it somehow, which I don't see happening. Any case, we'll see. To go back to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This is just pathetic stuff. How anyone can even take it seriously in the Muslim world today, in the Far East, anywhere where it's published. In the beginning of the structure of society, they were subject to brutal and blind force. Afterwards, to law, which is the same force, only disguised. I draw the conclusion that by the law of nature, right lies in force. As if any Jew even thinks such a thing, right lies in force. It's just, I mean, it's just pathetic stuff. This is just like outlandish. You know, political freedom is an idea, but not a fact. This idea one must know how to apply whenever it appears necessary with this bait of an idea to attract the masses. The Jews, as socialists and fighting for political freedom, are baiting the masses. Whenever it appears necessary with this bait of an idea to attract the mass of people to one's party for the purpose of crushing another who is in authority. This stuff is so horrendous and so maniacal that one wonders why anyone could take it seriously. Yet in Germany it was published as the last word of the Zionist plot, and it's still being published all over the world except in the West. And it was proved by an English writer in the 20s to be a forgery based on this, I don't know, anti-Napoleon III text. In our day, the power which was replaced that of the rulers who were liberal is the power of gold. Time was when faith ruled. The idea of freedom is impossible realization because no one knows how to use it with moderation. It's enough to hand over. This is supposed to be the elders of the Jews talking among themselves. This is like so scurrilous, it's frightening. Anyway, you can read most of this rubbish yourself. Try Mein Kampf if you want to read equal rubbish. I mean, no, it's worth reading. I have 2 copies of it in my house. You know, I mean, it's just incredible stuff. It's enough to hand over people to self-government for a certain length of time for that people to be turned into a disorganized mob. That's what's happening in Iraq perhaps today. From that moment on, we get an internecine strife which soon develops into battles between the classes, in the midst of which states burn down and their importance is reduced to that of a heap of ashes. So yeah, the Tsarist police would like this, because they can say this is what the socialists are trying to do, and they can make it out that the socialists are all run by Jewish people, and this is their plot to reduce the societies that we represent, the old conservative societies of Europe, to a heap of ashes. Next page, 87, just take a few more excerpts. Out of the temporary evil we are now compelled to commit will emerge the good of an unshakable rule, which will restore the regular course of the machinery of the national life brought to naught by liberalism. The result justifies the means. Well, this is like Nazism, not anything to do with that Jews know, that Jews think about or are involved in. I've never heard any Jew talk like this in my entire life. Let's see. 87 at the bottom. It's only with a despotic ruler that clans can be elaborated extensively and clear in such a way as to distribute the whole properly among the several parts of the machinery of the state. Without absolute despotism, there can be no existence of civilization. I've never heard a Jew talk like this in my entire life. And it goes on like that. This is more like Stalin. The mob is a savage and displays its savagery at every opportunity. The moment the mob seizes freedom in its hands, it quickly turns to anarchy. This is against the French Revolution here, which is why it was originally a Napoleon III text, which in itself is the highest degree of savagery. Behold, the alcoholized animals bemused with drink, the right to an immoderate use of which comes along with freedom. It is not for us and ours to walk that road. The peoples of the Goyim are bemused with alcohol liquors. Their youth has grown stupid on anyway, it goes on. Our countersign is force and make-believe. Our state, marching on the path of peaceful conquest. The would-be wise men, 89, of the Goyim, the intellectuals, could not make anything out of the uttered words of their abstractness. So anyway, it goes on like that. Finally, in all corners of the earth, the words liberty, equality, fraternity, 89 in the middle page, brought to our ranks, thanks to our blind agents, whole legions who bore our banners with enthusiasm. So the French Revolution is blamed on the Jews here. That's the leitmotif of the French Revolution. And all the time these words were cankerworms at work boring into the well-being of the Goyim, putting an end everywhere. So it's against the revolution in France. As you will see later, this helped us in our triumph. Well, anyway. 90, top. The abstraction of freedom has enabled us to persuade the mob in all countries that their government is nothing. This is when the socialists were working the lower classes up. And so basically they were trying to turn the masses against the socialists. The socialists were trying to use the masses, so they made it into a Jew-baiting document. And this is supposed to be the Jews meeting among themselves. Protocol 2, it goes on, I'm sure. I haven't seen the whole thing, and I don't even want to see much more of it. It's indispensable for our purpose that war, so far as possible, should not result in territorial gain. Well, yeah, that's right, we all agree with that. But these people want wars to result in territorial gain. The French, the Germans, and others in the 19th century. The Goyim are not guided by practical use of unprejudiced historical observation, but by theoretical routine without any critical regard for consequent results. Do not suppose for a moment that these statements are empty words. Think carefully of the successes we arranged for Darwinism, Marxism, Nietzscheism. To us Jews, at any rate, it should be plain to see what a disintegrating importance these directives have had on the minds of the Goyim. So this is after Darwin, and after they've added Nietzscheism in here, and Marxism. So the Jews are responsible for Darwinism and Nietzscheism. Finally, it is in the press that the triumph of freedom of speech finds its incarnation, but the Goyim states have not known how to make use of this force. The press, the Jewish control of the press. I thought Rupert Murdoch controlled the press now. I don't think that, who was that, Jane Fonda's husband, what was his name?
Ted Turner.
Yeah, Ted Turner, Rupert Murdoch. I don't know too many of these Jewish press barons. Maybe the mayor of New York, but he wasn't a big press baron. He had the financial sheet reporting, Bloomberg stock report. It's on television. It's one of the channels. Through the press, we have gained the power to influence while remaining ourselves in the shade. Thanks to the press, we've got the gold in our hands. Notwithstanding that we've had to gather it out of oceans of blood and tears, but has paid us, though we have sacrificed many of our people. Each victim on our side is worth, in the sight of a Goyim, of God, 1,000 Goyim. Well, this is just total and complete rubbish. That's all I can tell you. And it doesn't deserve to be read, and yet it should be read. Because people should know what is out there circulating. And, you know, what goes on and what is still circulating. This goes through the whole Islamic world today. This is out there. They believe that this is what, you know, the lovely, that was called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. Probably the Zionist movement had already gotten started, and so they could, you know, stick that on top of the thing as a secret plot by the Jews to take over the world. Okay, now we come to the real, I don't know whether we should read this, or I suppose I should have waited till we read some of the early precursors of Zionism. But since we've done it like this, let's have done with this, and then we'll go over to the precursors next time, okay? So look here, the Dreyfus event. We're way ahead of ourselves, but I can tell you a little bit about it. We have a selection here, of course, from Dreyfus's own discussion of his life. But what happened was, Dreyfus was one of the few Jewish individuals who were on the French general staff. And in fact, Dreyfus is probably a Sephardi name, not an Ashkenazi name. So it'd be probably from an older Sephardi family, perhaps. Here we have some selections in here from his autobiography, how, the story of his life. I don't know if you have time to read all that. And something from his diary that he kept on Devil's Island when they sent him off, I think, or before they sent him off. And then I guess we have some more from the diary here. In 1895, I think that would be about the trial period, and then after his return from Devil's Island in 1899. But the main document that we have here, which is really interesting, is Emile Zola's J'accuse. And now, this is what turned the tide in the whole affair in France. What was happening in France at this time, and I'll get to it in a minute, was that the whole country was being turned into what were called Dreyfusards and anti-Dreyfusards. I'm trying to get a date out of this introduction when actually the first hint of this affair began. But maybe it's in his autobiography here. I guess 1894, somewhere around that time, because he starts part 2 of his autobiography in 1894, and that's when things seem to go downhill. And he even gives 1895 on page 96. The degradation took place on Saturday, the 5th of January, 1895. So he came onto the general staff, if you like, around the year 1893 or so. So the dates here, pay attention to, for Dreyfus. And by the way, I was going to show a movie discussed, but I'm going to have time for Prisoner of Hope. You can get it at the video store, or sometimes it's on the cable channels. It's I think even produced by Richard Dreyfus. And funnily enough, Richard Dreyfus is a distant relative of this Alfred Dreyfus. I think Richard Dreyfus, the actor, was originally Canadian, but he's a distant relative of Alfred Dreyfus, and he produced this movie where he doesn't star as Alfred Dreyfus, he stars as the French officer who finally gave testimony to save Dreyfus from Devil's Island ultimately and bring him back. The officer who actually stayed true to the nobility of French military tradition. I forget what his name was, but he's probably mentioned in Zola. You know, France had fought a devastating war with Prussia, Germany, what we would call now, but Germany wasn't really a total entity at that time. Do any of you know what Prussia is as opposed to Germany? It doesn't exist anymore, Prussia, but it's a province of Germany.
It's in Poland.
It's on the edge, yeah. It's next to Poland. It's the German part, which is part of Poland now to some extent, and part of Germany. It's all mixed up. But it was then in the Polish area and the German area of the eastern part of Germany. Right? It was a very military sort of place. A very military sort of place with a very military king. And, I forget what the early Prussian rulers were called. But slowly, you know, Germany went into a process of unification in the 19th century. And the big moving force behind this was Bismarck. Count Bismarck. And he was the, I think, chief cabinet official of the Prussian king. And, you know, he's well known for the slogan, Blut und Eisen. You know, we do these things through blood and iron, which is what the Germans were really involved in until the present-day Germany is almost unrecognizable compared to the Germany of the past, which is hopefully will stay that way. But Germans are extremely peace-loving and very orderly, and they don't seem violent at all anymore. Though East Germany is a serious problem. You were mentioning that the Prussia is right next to that, and because they didn't undergo this gentrification, as it were. And a lot of the Nazi sort of grassroots ideology is still floating around in what was formerly communist East Germany. So the reunification of Germany that we all celebrated, for Germany itself was not necessarily a wonderful thing. Maybe it was nice for the fact that they could bring the people who were German and they felt a kinship of some kind of language with together, but it's been a difficult thing for them. And East Germany does not have the cultural sophistication of West Germany even today. And there's a lot of thugism in East Germany, quasi-Nazism actually. So the Russians, did nothing with East Germany except control and suppress it for the 40 or 50 years they were there. So that's not a very pleasant situation. But anyway, in the Franco-Prussian War, the early 1870s, I think 1871 or so, it was fought in the aftermath of the American Civil War, and similar to it, and it was a pretty lightning sort of war. And the German military machine just trounced the French military machine and even took Paris. There was this commune in Paris that revolted and stood up against the Germans. It was a total mess. I'm not a great expert on this period, but it left a horrendous taste in the mouth of the French, a kind of revanchism, a desire for revenge. And the Germans detached these provinces, Alsace-Lorraine, from France and took them. And that's what we have here. You take territory when you win wars. As if it's a Jewish concept. Anyway, they took Alsace-Lorraine, and then through the First World War and the Second, it was all fought over again, back and forth, back and forth. Finally, Alsace-Lorraine is back in French hands because the Germans lost the First and Second World Wars. But a lot of antagonism over those issues. Well, the French army was in turmoil. And then in the 1890s, there was some spying going on. Naturally, there would be in all countries. And a spy was discovered on the general's staff, at least the traces of a spy. And so a trail was left by the investigating body to point at Dreyfus, the only Jewish person on the general's staff. And they had a trial, and they forged evidence, and they convicted him. He writes it in his autobiography here. And they had a public, when a person is taken out of the army, what's it called?
Court-martial.
More than that, when they actually do it physically in public, when they pull off his epaulets and his buttons and all that. You have the right word. What'd you call it?
Discharge.
No, not discharge. It's a kind of humiliation. I forget what the word is, an actual technical term that is used. It's a result of a court-martial, but it's not the court-martial. The court-martial has already taken place. It's a, I forget what the word is. I'm sure in Google it you can find it, or in the thesaurus you can find it. And Herzl, Theodor Herzl, was the assimilated Jewish newspaper correspondent from one of the very best Austrian newspapers, who covered the trial and the public disgrace, or whatever I think that you refer to it as, humiliation or disgrace. Degradation, I think it's called. I think it was called I think it's called degradation is the word. Public degradation of Dreyfus. And he watched it as the correspondent, and up to that time he'd been basically a dandy, if you want, a assimilated person, and he'd been a belles lettres, someone who liked to write essays. He had flirted with playwriting. He had even written a novel or so. You know, someone who wanted to do writing and, you know, be an artist, or and he made his living as a newspaper correspondent and so on. And then he says in the Zionism book, I can show it to you. Way ahead of myself, so I shouldn't have done it in this order, but this is what happens when you're not very organized like me. He says, 1895, I have been occupied for some time past with a work which is of immeasurable greatness. This is in his diary. Shavuot, 1895. This is Dreyfus is humiliated, degraded in the beginning of January 1895. This is in June 1895. I cannot tell today whether I shall bring it to a close. It has the appearance of a gigantic dream. But for days and weeks it has filled me, saturated even my subconsciousness. It accompanies me wherever I go, broods over my ordinary daily converse, looks over my shoulder at my petty comical journalistic work, disturbs me and intoxicates me. What it will lead to, it is impossible to surmise, but my experience tells me that it is something marvelous, even as a dream, and that I should write it down. And then he goes back to his writer self, if not as a memorial for mankind, then for my own delight or meditation in later years. Anyway, the dream, or what has taken hold of him, is this Jewish state idea. When he finally publishes it, it's called Judenstaat. It's published around not long after. He has the prestige to get things published. We're going to look at that later. But Herzl is there, and he says he's possessed. Well, when he saw the thing, he says elsewhere, and he ran home when he heard the cries of the mob and the joy the street mob took in the degradation of Dreyfus, that he realized that assimilation was impossible in Europe. He realized that assimilation was impossible in Europe. And the only hope for the Jewish people was a state of their own. This is what he's saying is this fantastic dream. Now we're going to get the forerunners to this, but that is the background to Herzl's own, and he was gripped by this. He was worked like one possessed. He died in 1904. As a very young man, I think he was only 44 years old. He just worked himself to death over this for 9 years. He got very little thanks from his opponents among the Jews, who mocked him because he was not religious, who mocked him because he was secular, who said, oh, we're going to accept this Moses character coming to us from the West. We'll read how they laugh at him in Chaim Weizmann's writings and some of the other people's writings. But Herzl becomes the titanic figure, actually, primarily because of what transpired. If, in fact, what transpired is not transpired, I guess we would say it was only a romantic idea. But he becomes a titanic figure because when you read his work, and we will read it, you see that he knows something terrible is in store for the Jewish people, and very soon he understands that intuitively. And the reason he understands it is he lives in the West. He lives in Vienna and Berlin and Paris and London. He knows the West. The masses of Eastern Europe are living in a fog. They have no idea what's coming down the highway towards them. They have no understanding and couldn't possibly foresee what he, living out like Plato's cave out in the light, can see. And he has the influence and the insight to do something about it, or to try to do something about it. So he does work as one possessed, and we will discuss that again in the future. But before I finish up today, I want to go to Zola's defense of Dreyfus. Look at that piece here. But to finish up the greatness of Herzl, as we, I think, can and will see, is that he knows it's going to happen soon. And he knows he has only a certain amount of time to affect what he's going to affect. And he even says another point in his diaries as he's talking in London to the masses of Jews there who are receiving him with enthusiasm, that he says, everyone thinks that what I'm talking about is a dream. He says, but in 50 years, they will see it will be a reality. And I think he said that somewhere like in 19, or maybe he said in 45 years. Anyway, he almost predicted it on the spot how long it would take for this to come to be. He knew how long it was going to take and when it would be. He understood that. But he worked himself so hard. He ran to Palestine. He went to meet the Ottoman emperor, the Sultan. He went to the British governments. He went to all the Russian governments, the German governments, and they received him as an emissary of the Jewish people for some reason. And he just wore himself out. And I think he caught malaria in Palestine or whatever, but in any case, he died of a heart attack in 1904, and we'll see, we'll talk about that. They just, if you read the Israeli papers, the ones that are on those websites, I think I mentioned it to you, they just brought the remains of his children back to Israel for burial last month. He wanted his children to be buried beside him. And I think I mentioned that to you in this class earlier about the controversy that was going on in Israel over that particular thing. Several died in the Holocaust and so on and so forth. One committed suicide and the other after conversion and reconversion. And just a tragic final story of what always happens to great men's. It happened to Lincoln's family and so on. Great men's heirs often. This happens to them. Not the Bush family, not your Bush family. I'm talking about the Bush White House family. It never happens to people like that. George Bush, nothing ever happens. The senior, I'm talking about, nothing ever happens to him. But people like Herzl, it happens to. Let's just take a look quickly then, before you go. I think we have time a little bit to look at and then we'll go back and read those selections next time that I told you we want to read. Kalischer, Alkali, Hess, Pinsker, Herzl, and so on. Won't read them all next time, we'll read some of them. Emile Zola J'accuse on 103. J'accuse means in French, I accuse. Emile Zola was a great French novelist who was only known before, and he was a friend of Cézanne. He was only known before and before this as writing realistic novels and so on. I'll keep you about 10 minutes past 9:30 here because I started a bit late with the exam. And he wasn't known as a political person at all, but he was extremely honorable. When he saw the miscarriage of justice that had occurred when they sent Dreyfus, and you should read Dreyfus's discussion of the affair that we have preceding this, he finally wrote a letter to one of the principal French newspapers, addressed to the President of the French Republic. Monsieur le Président, 103, will you permit me in my gratitude for the kindly welcome you once extended me to have a care for the glory that belongs to you as, of course, the President of the country, to say to you that your star, so lucky that it was threatened with the most shameful, most ineffaceable stain, etc., etc. What a mud stain on your name. I was going to say on your reign is this abominable Dreyfus affair. Esterhazy was the one who actually did it, and he framed Dreyfus and so on. They acquitted Esterhazy. France has the stain upon her cheek. And you, 104, Monsieur le Président, will I cry this truth with all the force of an honest man's revolt. Because of your honor, I am convinced that you are ignorant of it. First, the truth of the trial and the conviction of Dreyfus. Here's how he puts this. A calamitous man managed it. This was the secret policeman who put it all together. That is the trial and the frame-up. Has done it all. Colonel Dupaté de Clam, then a simple major. He is the entire Dreyfus case. Be fully known only when a sincere investigation shall have clearly established his acts and responsibilities. He appears as the most heady, the most intricate of minds, haunted with romantic intrigues, delighting in the methods of the newspaper, novels, stolen papers, anonymous letters, meetings in deserted spots, mysterious women. It is he who conceived the idea of dictating there was some sort of letter that was supposed to be in Dreyfus's handwriting that was found in a trash basket. Anyway, he goes through all those things and explains what this Major du Pâté de Clam did over the next few other pages. This was all printed in the newspaper, an attack on the French army and so on. You can read that yourselves. And then on page 107, he just talks about how they stir France up. These then, Mr. President, are the facts which explain how it was possible to commit such a judicial error. And he mentions some more people that you can read about. I guess it's Colonel Picard, 108, who Dreyfus portrays in the movie, has done his duty as an honest man. He's the one, apparently, who came forward and started to unravel this, and even though he was no Semite or anti-Semite, he was just an honorable man, and he started to bring the truth forward within the army. 110. There you have then, Mr. President, the Esterhazy case, a guilty man to be declared innocent. Further along, Dreyfus has been condemned for the crime of treason by council of war. Then he is guilty, and we at council of war cannot declare him innocent. Now we know that to recognize Esterhazy's guilt would be to proclaim the innocence of Dreyfus. Nothing can turn them from that course. So the reasoning of the court-martial later on that reconsidered it was, we would have to admit a mistake, which would be ludicrous, therefore we're not going to do that. They talk to us, next paragraph in 110 at the bottom, of the honor of the army. They want us to love it, respect it. Certainly, yes, the army, which will rise at the first threat, which would defend French soil. The army is the whole people. We have it for nothing but tenderness and respect, but it is not the question of that army whose dignities our special desire in our need of justice. It is the sword that is in question, the master that they may give us tomorrow, and piously kiss the sword hilt, the god, no. And next page, 111, and what a nest of base intrigues, gossip, and deceit. We are frightened by the terrible light thrown upon it by the Dreyfus case, the human sacrifice of an unfortunate, dirty Jew. Oh, what a mixture of madness and folly. So he goes on like that. So finally, we come to the end, which is the stirring part of the whole letter, 112. Such is the simple truth, Monsieur le Président, in the middle of 112. Nor indeed that I despair the least in the world of triumph. I repeat with more vehement certainty, truth is on the march and nothing will stop it. Today sees the real beginning of the affair, since not until today have the positions become clear. On the one hand, the guilty who do not want the light. On the other hand, the doers of justice who will give their lives to get it. When truth is buried in the earth, it accumulates there and assumes so mighty an explosive power that on the day when it bursts forth, it hurls everything in the air. We shall see if they have not just made preparations for the most resounding of disasters yet to come, but this letter is long, Mr. President. It's time to finish. And then we get the accuse. I accuse Lieutenant Colonel de Pâté de Clam of having been the diabolical workman of a judicial error unconsciously. I am willing to believe, and of having then defended his calamitous work for 3 years by the most guilty machinations. I accuse General Mercier of having made himself an accomplice. I accuse General Bilot of having had in his hands certain proofs of Dreyfus' innocence and having stifled them. I accuse this is the whole French general staff, General de Boisdef and General Gans of having made themselves accomplices in the same crime, one undoubtedly through clerical passion. I accuse General de Polleux and Major Ravary of having conducted a rascally inquiry. I accuse 3 experts in handwriting, Bellam, Bernard, and Couard, of having made lying and fraudulent reports. I accuse the war officers of having carried on in the press, particularly in the Éclair and the Echo de Paris, 2 French newspapers, an abominable campaign to mislead the public and cover up their faults. I accuse, finally, the First Council of War of having violated the law by condemning an accused person on the strength of a secret document. And in preferring these charges, I am not unaware that I lay myself liable under Articles 30 and 31 of the Press Law of July 29, 1881, which punishes defamation. And I'm And it is willfully that I expose myself to this. And as for the people whom I accuse, I do not know them. I've never seen them. I entertain against them no feeling of revenge or hatred. They are to me simple entities, spirits of social ill-doing, and the act that I perform here is nothing but a revolutionary measure to hasten the explosion of truth and justice. I have but one passion, the passion for light, in the name of humanity, which has suffered so much and which is entitled to happiness. My fiery protest is simply the cry of my soul. Let them dare then to bring me into the court for libel or whatever you want to call it, defamation. Seized court. Let the investigation take place in the open light of day. I await it, except, Monsieur President, the assurance of my profound respect. Well, this was like a bombshell in France. This put all the cards on the table. One of the most famous writers in France writing this letter in the newspaper accusing the whole army and general staff of perfidy and corruption and rottenness. And it was a huge affair, but Zola himself ultimately had to flee to London for some years before things quieted down. And finally Dreyfus he wasn't cleared. They just pardoned him and brought him back from Devil's Island and so on. He explains it in his autobiography, you can read that. But the most tragic thing of all, I think someone tried to shoot Dreyfus, as I recall, and he was wounded. I don't remember the whole story, you can look it up if you're interested further in it. But the most tragic part of the whole affair was what happened to Zola himself. When he came back from from London, after the thing had finally shaken out and Dreyfus had come back, I think he was a bit disappointed in Dreyfus's behavior, because Dreyfus didn't want to rock the boat, he just wanted to get on with his life. He stayed on the French general staff and fought in the First World War pretty honorably. Zola was living in an apartment building in Paris, and someone went up on the roof and put a clog into the chimney to his apartment, and he and his wife and family were all asphyxiated. That was the end of an honorable man. That's the price that he paid. Dreyfus didn't pay that price. Zola paid the price. It's an incredibly interesting event, and this is what triggers Herzl, as we'll see. Okay, so yeah.
I had a viewpoint that came through Degas, the French painter.
Sure.
One of his best friends was Jewish, and he had dinner almost every weekend.
Some of those artists were Jewish. A few of those, I think,
Pissarro
yeah,
was also one of his best friends.
Right.
He did the Impressionist shows with
Right.
him. After the Dreyfus affair, he was a rabid anti-Semite.
Who?
Degas.
Yeah, well, it's not.
And
It
before
can happen
that,
to
he
the best
wasn't.
of people. What?
Before that, he wasn't.
Yeah, it's weird. This is very strange. You know, as people who believe the propaganda think the French state is being degraded, but the whole thing, I think, has to be viewed in terms of the Franco-Prussian War, the demoralization of the French army. And we see in the First World War that the demoralization had not stopped. I mean, Verdun and places, they fought fairly bravely and lost a lot of people. But it was a downward curve, you know, that went into what we finally ended up with France in the Second World War was really rather pathetic. The British had to end up sinking the French fleet off of the coast of Algeria and Morocco, lest the Nazis got a hold of the fleet and used it against the Allies. The British literally sunk the French fleet with French on it, if you know that. A huge decision that Churchill made. You know, the French became collaborators and so on. So the glory of France really did, except for the Maquis and some of the underground people like Albert Camus and the others who made a big cause celebre out of some of these things. The French did not equip themselves well in the last century, but this Dreyfus affair was really turned people for or against, so it was a huge matter. Okay, so we'll go to the Zionist writings. I meant to get there today, but it doesn't hurt to give you some background. Good luck, man. I hope you all knew all this had happened, right? You didn't know about all these things?